1867. Ottawa. The ink is barely dry on the British North America Act when a telegraph arrives at the new Dominion government offices. It's from a railway town in Ontario, population 3,000, and the message is as audacious as it is simple. They've passed their own immigration law. Not suggestions, not recommendations. An actual statute, complete with penalties, dictating exactly who can and cannot settle within their municipal boundaries. The federal government stares at the telegram, confronted with a question that will haunt Canadian governance for the next 50 years. Can they even do that? The answer, for decades, was yes. They absolutely could. Before Canada became a nation of uniform federal and provincial codes, before the Constitution's centralized power in Ottawa and the provincial capitals, there existed a sprawling patchwork of municipal autonomy so complete that neighboring towns could operate under fundamentally different legal systems. A bridge spanning a river might cross not just into another jurisdiction, but into an entirely different conception of what government could regulate, tax, permit, or prohibit. This wasn't chaos. This was Canada's first experiment in self-governance, thousands of communities writing their own rules, enforcing their own standards, and occasionally colliding with the centralizing forces that would ultimately reshape the entire country. The story of Canadian municipal autonomy isn't just legal history. It's the story of who gets to decide how people live, work, and build their communities. And for a brief, wild period, the answer was the towns themselves. The legal architecture supporting municipal autonomy arrived with the British colonial system, but it mutated almost immediately upon contact with Canadian geography. British municipal corporations operated within tightly defined parameters, constrained by centuries of parliamentary supremacy and common law precedent. Canadian towns inherited the framework, but occupied a fundamentally different landscape, both literally and politically. The Province of Canada Act of 1849 created the legal mechanism for incorporation, but its most revolutionary provision wasn't what it required municipalities to do. It was what it allowed them to do. Section after section granted power to make bylaws covering everything from public morals to infrastructure development, and from business licensing to building standards. The language was deliberately broad, a practical necessity in a colony where the central government couldn't possibly micromanage thousands of scattered settlements, separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness, months of winter isolation, and communication systems that moved at the speed of horses. Upper Canada, what would become Ontario, led the way. By 1850, the Baldwin Act established a municipal framework so permissive that legal scholars would later describe it as the most decentralized local government system in the British Empire. Towns weren't just administrative subdivisions. They were legislative bodies with sweeping authority to regulate almost every aspect of local life. The municipalities seized that authority with enthusiasm that bordered on aggression. Walk into any Ontario Town Council meeting in 1870, and you'd witness something that would be unthinkable today. Local politicians casually legislating on matters we now consider fundamental federal or provincial responsibilities. Immigration and settlement. Towns passed bylaws specifying who could establish residence, what kind of housing they could build, and under what conditions they could be expelled. When Chinese labourers began arriving in British Columbia railway towns during the 1880s, municipal councils didn't wait for federal immigration policy. They simply passed local ordinances restricting where Chinese residents could live, work, or own property. These weren't suggestions subject to higher review. They were enforceable laws backed by municipal police power and local courts. Criminal justice. Municipal bylaws criminalized behaviors that went far beyond simple public nuisance. Towns created their own misdemeanors, set their own penalties, and operated their own court systems with mayors or appointed magistrates dispensing justice that carried the full force of law. A behavior legal in one town could land you in the municipal lockup 20 miles down the road. Drunkenness, Sabbath breaking, inappropriate language, improper dress, all subject to local definition and local punishment. Economic regulation. Every business license, every trade permit, every zoning designation flowed from municipal authority. Towns didn't just regulate commerce, they structured it according to local preference. Some municipalities banned certain businesses outright. Others created elaborate licensing schemes that functioned as de facto monopolies for favoured interests. Railway towns like Brockville and Kingston negotiated directly with railway companies, granting rights-of-way and terminal locations in exchange for economic concessions that Ottawa had no say in approving. Public health and safety. When cholera outbreaks swept through the St. Lawrence River Valley in the 1850s, municipalities responded with quarantine powers that would make modern constitutional lawyers recoil. Towns established inspection regimes, mandated sanitation standards, and forcibly removed residents deemed health threats. They built waterworks, installed sewerage, and passed building codes, all without provincial blueprints or federal oversight. Taxation. Municipal councils levied property taxes, poll taxes, business taxes, and special assessments with minimal constraint. The only real limit was political. Tax too aggressively and residents would elect new councillors. Tax too lightly and services collapsed. But the power itself was nearly absolute. Towns funded themselves however they saw fit. The result was a country where crossing a municipal boundary meant entering a different legal regime. Behaviour tolerated in Toronto might be criminal in Hamilton. A business legal in Montreal could be prohibited in Quebec City. Property rights recognised in one jurisdiction might not transfer to the next. Nothing exposed the tensions in this system like the railways. By 1860, railway construction was accelerating across British North America, but the tracks didn't respect municipal boundaries any more than they respected geography. A rail line connecting Montreal to the Atlantic coast might pass through 50 different municipalities, each with its own regulations about right-of-way acquisition, each with its own safety standards, each with its own ideas about taxation and compensation. The Grand Trunk Railway, the era's equivalent of a national infrastructure project, found itself negotiating with dozens of town councils, each wielding genuine legislative authority. Some towns demanded cash payments, others wanted stations built in specific locations. Still others insisted on local hiring requirements or specified which days trains could operate and at what speeds. In 1861, the town of Collingwood, Ontario, population 1,800, passed a by-law regulating railway operations within its boundaries that directly contradicted the company's provincial charter. The railway company challenged the by-law in court, confident that their provincial incorporation would supersede local regulation. They lost. The judge's ruling was unambiguous. The provincial charter granted the railway the right to build and operate, but it didn't exempt them from legitimate municipal regulation. If Collingwood wanted trains to stop at every crossing within town limits, blow whistles at specific intervals, and maintain track to higher standards than required elsewhere, and that was within their authority as an incorporated municipality. The implications rippled across the entire rail network. Every town with tracks became a potential regulatory choke point. Some used this power responsibly, others weaponized it for economic advantage or political leverage. When the Intercolonial Railway began construction in the 1870s, a genuinely national project linking the Maritimes to central Canada, the federal government found itself essentially powerless to override municipal obstruction. Towns demanded concessions, delayed approvals, and extracted maximum value from their geographic necessity. The railway that was supposed to unite the nation instead became a case study in the limits of federal power against entrenched municipal autonomy. Confederation in 1867 created a new dynamic. The British North America Act established federal and provincial jurisdictions, But municipal powers existed in a constitutional grey zone. Were municipalities merely creatures of provincial statute, subject to amendment or abolition at will? Or did their powers have some kind of inherent status rooted in British law and local practice? The question came to a head in the 1880s and 1890s as federal ambitions collided with municipal realities. The Federal Criminal Code, enacted in 1892, attempted to standardize criminal law across Canada. But municipalities had been defining and prosecuting crimes for decades through their bylaw systems. Towns didn't surrender this authority easily. They simply reframed their regulations as public order measures or moral standards rather than criminal law, a semantic dodge that preserved enforcement power while technically avoiding federal preemption. Provincial governments, meanwhile, faced their own challenges. They wanted to regulate public health, workplace safety, and economic development, but found their initiatives frustrated by municipal governments that had gotten there first. In Ontario, the provincial government passed factory safety legislation in 1886, only to discover that many manufacturing towns had already enacted more stringent local requirements and saw no reason to weaken them to match the provincial standard. The courts became the battleground where these tensions played out case by case, precedent by precedent. In 1883, the Supreme Court of Canada heard Hodge versus the Queen, a case involving an Ontario municipality's liquor licensing by law. The decision established what would become known as the plenary powers doctrine. Within their jurisdictional sphere, municipalities exercised powers as complete and absolute as Parliament itself. They weren't just administrative conveniences, they were genuine governments. But what defined that jurisdictional sphere? The courts struggled with the question for decades, producing contradictory rulings that left everyone confused about where municipal authority ended and provincial or federal jurisdiction began. Nowhere did municipal autonomy collide more violently with emerging national identity than in immigration policy. Ottawa wanted immigrants, the West needed settlers. National policy demanded population growth, but individual municipalities often had very different ideas about who should be welcome. When the Canadian Pacific Railway brought Chinese labourers to British Columbia in the 1880s, Vancouver and Victoria responded with municipal bylaws so restrictive they functioned as local exclusion acts. These weren't subtle measures, they prohibited Chinese residents from employment in specific industries, restricted where they could live and operate businesses, and imposed licensing fees calibrated to drive them out. The federal government objected, not necessarily on moral grounds, but because municipal immigration restrictions interfered with national labour needs and international treaty obligations. But what could Ottawa actually do? The municipalities cited their broad regulatory powers over public health, public morals, and business licensing. They weren't regulating immigration, they argued. They were exercising legitimate local control over sanitation, moral standards, and economic development. The legal argument was specious, but the practical reality made it work. Enforcement happened locally. Municipal police answered to municipal councils. Municipal courts interpreted municipal bylaws. Even if federal law theoretically preempted local regulation, who would enforce that preemption? Similar dynamics played out in Ontario and Quebec with different target populations. Some towns passed bylaws restricting Jewish settlement or business ownership. Others created licensing schemes that effectively excluded Catholic or Protestant minorities, depending on local demographics. These measures rarely stated their discriminatory intent explicitly. They used neutral language about character requirements or community standards, but everyone understood their purpose. The federal government found itself in an impossible position, theoretically supreme but practically impotent against 1,000 municipal jurisdictions, each exercising what they considered legitimate local authority. The First World War shattered the equilibrium. War required centralized control. It demanded uniform standards, coordinated logistics, and federal supremacy that couldn't be vetoed by local councils. The War Measures Act of 1914 granted Ottawa powers that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, and those powers didn't fully recede when peace returned. The wartime experience demonstrated that complex modern challenges, whether military mobilization, public health crises, or economic coordination, couldn't be managed by thousands of semi-autonomous municipalities, each pursuing their own policies. The cholera outbreaks of the 1850s had been local problems requiring local solutions. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 was a national crisis that exposed the dysfunction of fragmented municipal authority. Towns implemented different quarantine measures, different isolation requirements, to different public health standards. The disease exploited every gap in coordination. But the real shift happened more gradually, through legislation that slowly transferred municipal powers upward to provincial capitals. Ontario's Municipal Act revisions in the 1920s began explicitly limiting what municipalities could regulate. Provincial health standards superseded local boards. Provincial building codes replaced municipal variations. Provincial business licensing schemes absorbed local systems. The changes came incrementally, justified case by case as necessary for public safety, economic efficiency, or constitutional clarity. By 1930, the landscape had shifted fundamentally. Municipalities still had powers, extensive powers, but they exercised them within an increasingly defined and limited scope. The wild autonomy of the 1870s and 1880s, where towns could genuinely experiment with different approaches to governance. He had given way to a hierarchical system where municipalities implemented provincial policy more than they created local law. The centralization of Canadian governance wasn't a simple story of progress or decline. It solved real problems while creating new ones. The chaos of competing municipal standards genuinely hampered economic development. A business operating across multiple jurisdictions faced regulatory compliance nightmares. Railway companies trying to build intercity networks struggled against dozens of conflicting local requirements. Public health measures worked better when coordinated provincially rather than implemented piecemeal by individual towns. And something was lost too. The capacity for genuine local experimentation and community self-determination. When early Canadian municipalities regulated immigration, many used that power for exclusion and discrimination, but others used it to create refugees. Some Quebec towns leveraged their autonomy to resist Anglicization pressures. Some Ontario communities used local control to preserve specific cultural or religious identities against homogenizing provincial norms. The power that enabled discrimination also enabled protection. When municipalities controlled economic development through licensing and zoning, some created corrupt monopolies and barriers to competition, but others pioneered innovative approaches to urban planning, cooperative economics, and local wealth creation that provincial governments later adopted and standardized. The municipal experimentation with public health, building standards, and infrastructure development produced both disasters and breakthroughs. For every town that built an inadequate water system that poisoned residents, another developed filtration methods or sanitation practices ahead of their time. Modern municipal governments inherit a strange compromise: extensive administrative responsibilities but limited legislative authority. They manage infrastructure, deliver services, and regulate land use, but they do so increasingly within frameworks defined by provincial legislation. A contemporary Ontario Town Council can't pass a bylaw excluding specific immigrant groups, can't criminalize behaviors the province hasn't already prohibited, can't defy federal infrastructure projects. Whether that represents democratic maturity or the loss of genuine local self-governance depends on which aspects of the old system you valued most. Stand at a municipal council meeting today and you'll still hear echoes of that 1867 telegraph. The specific issues have changed. Now it's supervised injection sites, refugee resettlement, pipeline approval, housing development. But the underlying question remains, who decides? When federal policy conflicts with local values, do communities have the right to resist through legitimate local authority? When provincial standardization threatens local autonomy, where's the line between necessary coordination and centralized overreach? Canada resolved these questions through law, through court precedent, through the gradual accumulation of federal and provincial power. But the resolution was never absolute. Municipal governments still test boundaries, still push against constraints, may still claim authorities that higher levels of government dispute. The era when towns made their own laws wasn't orderly. It wasn't always just. It produced outcomes that ranged from innovative to catastrophic, often in neighboring jurisdictions separated by a single road. But it was undeniably Canadian. Pragmatic adaptation to geography and diversity, messy compromise between competing visions of community, and the persistent belief that people closest to problems should have meaningful authority to solve them. That belief didn't die when centralization arrived. It just got more complicated.